Okay, so my name is Lindsay Martin. I'm currently the Chief Director for Provincial and Local Government Infrastructure at National Treasury. So I'm in our, what we call our Intergovernmental Relations Division. So I suppose I've been at Treasury for a while, for the last 9 years or so. I started off in the Budget Office, dealing with infrastructure financing issues in relation to the budget. At that stage, we developed what we call a set of capital budgeting guidelines, which assessed how projects should be packaged for funding as part of the budget. After that, I moved to the Intergovernmental Relations section to manage the infrastructure grant to provinces. So over the 4 years when I was doing that job, the grant increased from about 9 billion to about 11 billion. So we funded what we call the 4 core provincial sectors, which is health infrastructure, education infrastructure, and roads and transport, and to a limited extent agriculture. So I spent 4 years doing that. As part of that time, I was also part of a capacity building program, which was rolled out by national government. We had a partnership between National Treasury, the Construction Industry Development Board, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and Public Works to establish a capacity building program to deal with failures across provincial departments. So this is where sort of the whole concept around the IDMS started. So I was part of that program management team who developed the initial toolkit and set of guidelines around the IDMS. So the IDMS stands for the Infrastructure Delivery Management System. It's essentially a methodology aligned to public sector legislation on how best to go about planning and delivering for infrastructure. The only way I suppose you can minimize corruption, and it's linked quite closely to the concept of value for money. So when I was talking about the concept of value for money, I mentioned the 3 E's. So the economy, the efficiency, and the effectiveness. To a large extent at the economy level, it's a bit easier to, I suppose, minimize wastage within the system, because it's dealing with a set of inputs that influence your delivery. A lot of those inputs are essentially available within the economy, so within the market. So consultants are available within the market, the actual components that make up a project. So getting the labor, the cement and the steel and those components for a construction project are available within the market. So one of the easy ways in dealing with the economy side is to have a set of market indices for those types of prices. The challenge we have at the moment, even though there are market prices available, when people do work on behalf of the public sector, in most cases those prices are inflated. So that's one example of how it's quite easy. If you have a system with a set of price indices, you can benchmark against those. So if you minimize it from the input level, that's a starting point. At the what we call the efficiency level, this is where you actually do the design work for a project and the actual execution, the implementation component. So that's where you get things like consulting engineers to assist you, and that's where you also then bring in your construction managers who manage contractors on site. The key is to build the competency of those people so that they can manage to achieve the best outcomes for the client, which is government. And to make sure that by having what we call a control system for the IDMS, which essentially says from one step or from one decision to the next, you have to document those decisions and you have to get sign-off. So that should hopefully bring in some more transparency in the system and shows why decisions were taken to either escalate prices or to manage prices downwards, for example. So that deals with the first 2 components. The last one on the effectiveness is really about achieving longer term outcomes. So if we have a school or if we have a clinic, we want to actually make sure that clinic, together with the nurses and the doctors that work there, are able to deliver a healthcare service. So the same for a school, to make sure the teachers, the desks and the chairs actually deliver a quality education product. So one way we were thinking is, so you've got all these other measures in place. We've never done comprehensive, what we call post-implementation reviews. And this is something that it's started over the last, sort of this term of government with the Department of Performance Monitoring and Evaluation. Is essentially to assess our government departments contributing to those outcomes of government. One of the mechanisms that they use to do that is what they call performance or expenditure reviews. So if we start to conduct these across different projects or a sample of projects, you can immediately pick up where there's been significant variance in terms of cost, and you can learn some lessons as to how to minimize those in the longer term. So it will take some time, but I think we will eventually get there. So you're quite correct. The big reform we're busy with at the moment. So we've always had in place supply chain regulations as part of the Treasury regulations. Those were largely tailored towards dealing with what we call goods and services items. So if you need to buy stationery or you need to buy IT equipment, those are what we call goods and services, or you're buying a service on behalf of government, like security services. Now, the key difference between those types of procurement and the procurement for infrastructure is that on the goods and services components, you have a product which is available. So everybody knows if you go to a C&A, what a pen or a printer looks like, because they specify the product attributes and they have a market price available for it. So it's quite easy for government to be able to benchmark for goods and services. The difference for infrastructure is you essentially building the product on the site. So nobody knows exactly what the school will look like until it's built. And so this is why we felt that you need a different set of skills for assessing the quality and the functionality of a product when you're dealing with goods and services, because most of them are known, as opposed to when you're dealing with infrastructure. We think you need a lot more built environment expertise up front as part of those technical assessments to specify the specifications you want to achieve and to manage the project essentially, to deliver that product. Our control framework, as we call it, is built around a set of what we call stages or gates. So when I was talking about requirements for planning, design, execution, closeout, it's not as part of the slides. They are available on the toolkit on the CIDB website, which specifies those gates. So we essentially said, to be able to plan, you must be able to develop an infrastructure plan, for example, which must have a costing for those projects over the life of those projects. That plan must then be signed off by the head of that department. So for example, that would be one control point or one gate. So before you can get into a supply chain process, you must have an infrastructure plan that's signed off. So there's a variety of those gates as you move through the delivery chain at different stages, where you need sign-offs before you can proceed. So that's the logic behind it, is to have almost like a gateway system. The key differences, we try to make distinctions between what we call portfolio management versus program and project management. A portfolio is essentially, it's a combination of projects and programs for an institution. What we want to propose, I suppose it's already done internationally in certain countries, is when you're assessing your workload at a portfolio level, you then have a good sense of what is my budget, what do I need to deliver for that budget. You can then start making decisions about the options to best deliver that. So what projects do you package together if they are similar to achieve efficiencies? Which projects do you need to have standalone? So for example, if you're delivering a large hospital project or a large project pipeline like Transnet is doing, in most cases you need a different set of skills to deal with large projects because you can deal with them as large standalone projects. For smaller routine projects like maintenance, to a large extent you can bundle or package those and have similar services. So it becomes easier for what we call for client departments to manage once they've made some decisions at the portfolio level. So the way they then deal with their programs and projects is almost to an extent predetermined up front. And you can then build in a lot of your developmental requirements up front. I think one of the starting points is similar to the methodology which we're trying to prescribe as part of the IDMS. We have a lot of engagements with the private sector across different departments. I mean, just in the work that I do, I know of a number of different sort of partnership agreements that different departments have with different entities or associations. The problem we have is that we're not, from a public sector perspective, all speaking the same language. So we set different requirements for similar things, and in most cases that creates confusion. So we think a methodology like the IDMS provides some uniformity to say if you're dealing with the public sector, it doesn't matter where you're based. The methodology and the terminology we're using is similar. So when we agree to say the private sector must support us on planning for this work, they all understand, no matter where you're doing that, it's a similar type of function. So we think that will partly go some way towards building better trust. We also think from the private sector perspective, and this is something that we had picked up as part of the review that we had done, there's a lot of work to be done from the private sector perspective as well, in terms of building their own capacity to deal with the public sector. Because if there are weak, what we call client departments, to a large extent the private sector will then push a particular agenda that doesn't always meet the objectives of government. So we're hoping is by the two parties almost coming together with some sort of agreement, that will build a longer term partnership. It's an interesting question because I suppose the notion of best practice is that you always improve. Because if it's best practice, what was best practice in the past, if you've learned some lessons, you can improve on that practice. So the approach that we want to adopt is firstly create some awareness across the public sector on what we think is current best practice. So, and there's a number of different mechanisms to do that. Part of those mechanisms are through training interventions. We also want to use the private sector to preach a similar message when they're dealing with public sector clients. Obviously, by regulating it through a set of regulations, it is mandatory to an extent. I suppose the tricky bit from a finance or treasury perspective is you can't be everywhere at the same time. So there's a lot of responsibility on the heads of departments or the executive authorities of those entities to make sure their entities or institutions are doing the right thing. We also then want to be able to leverage off mechanisms that are already there, like the Auditor General. So the Auditor General on an annual basis conducts audits across all government departments. We basically want to use this type of methodology to say, when you're doing your audit for an infrastructure delivery chain within a department, these are almost the processes that you must check and whether they've been followed. But it will take time. It won't be done overnight. So one of the aspects, I suppose, which I didn't talk that much to in the earlier presentation, is that having a proper asset management system is almost a prerequisite to proper planning. So it's your planning requirements that set a lot of the what we call the specifications or the input requirements for delivery. So if you have poor information on your existing asset base, so if you don't know where your facilities are located, you don't know what state they're in, you don't know what land you own, that definitely complicates your planning function and compromises the achievement of value for money. So you're quite correct, is that effective asset management is quite core to the entire IDMS methodology. We've spoken quite a lot about the supply chain components, which I spoke about earlier, but asset management is something we've also identified. There's a lot of activity or initiatives across different government departments who are looking to put in place maintenance strategies to support asset management. So we want to essentially learn from those and incorporate them into this methodology. It's quite complicated. So I suppose some of it is historical. So to a large extent, when you're dealing with urban centres, I think most government departments or entities have a good sense of the type of assets they own. The challenge we had, sort of as we transitioned post or pre-94, there were a lot of what we call the homeland states, okay, which have now been incorporated into provincial governments or have established local governments in those areas. The ownership rights within those circumstances were not clearly defined. So if you go to parts of northern KZN, if you go to parts of the Eastern Cape, where there was the former Transkei, there was a lot of communal land, or almost, what would we call it? Land under the custodianship of the chiefs and the kings and those types of people. So where the title deeds were not that clear. So that's one factor that impacted on it. And now you need a process essentially to go out to survey that land, to say, is it private, is it public sector, to catalogue it. And unfortunately, it's taken a long time for government to do that. The poor state of the asset registers is also an issue. So when the 9 provinces were established, you essentially moved from a situation where you had 5 provinces to having 9. The split was not seamless. So information that was, for example, catalogued for a province like the Western Cape would be quite good, because historically they've been doing that. But when the Eastern Cape was formed, they had to essentially take over those systems and manage them. And I think that's partly where the failure came in. The skill shortage is a big concern, and it's a concern across the entire economy. It's not just the public sector, because although the public sector manages a set of budgets, in most cases the contractors and the consulting engineers come from the private sector. So they essentially support and complement government in the work that it does. One of the initiatives which we are working on, which I've also mentioned, is the the skills program with the Department of Higher Education and Training. So they're supporting the Presidential Infrastructure Coordinating Commission to try and identify what is that gap across different core technical skills. So all the way from the artisans up to, for example, the requirement for registered engineers and architects. So they're trying to assess what that gap is and then identify in different types of interventions depending on the type of skill that you want to build. And again, they've also noted it's not going to be easy because you're not going to have, it's not going to be a short-term process. Because you're building the pipeline all the way from the higher education institutions to getting people registered, to getting them work experience, so they gain years of experience on projects so that they're able to manage and deliver. So it will take time, but at least one of the positive things is there is a plan in place which has been endorsed basically nationally. The intention of this approach to internal control, the control framework that we have, the intention is that if people follow the approach, is they will have a clear audit trail, because they will document decisions as they go along the delivery chain in terms of delivering a project. The big challenges we've had at the moment, and you can see it from most of the audit reports which the Auditor General publishes, is the audit trail is not that clear at the moment. So there's issues in terms of documentation, lack of documentation. There's issues in terms of having the correct systems in place to be able to record information. We're hoping is that by having an approach that pushes a methodology for internal control, is that we will improve that audit trail in the longer term. And hopefully that also then creates transparency in terms of decisions. I think you've touched on quite a bit. Maybe one of the things to also briefly touch on is the issue on when we spoke about government's intention to think about procurement strategically, which is one of the things which is in the National Development Plan. We are developing what we call a framework for strategic procurement, which basically means that government, because it's so large, we've never done a proper assessment on the types of things that government buys, on the types of suppliers that government needs as parts of its value chain. So we haven't used that size of government to be able to negotiate better value. So one of the things that the framework for strategic procurement wants to achieve is to put in place systems that's able to do that. It also then intends to create better professionalization of the supply chain management process. So at the moment, most people see supply chain management as almost an administrative process. So they usually delegate it to lower level people to make decisions. We now want to elevate those decisions to a strategic level where essentially management, executive management and senior management make decisions up front about procurement approaches and procurement strategies before it gets to an actual event where you need to go out to procure.